You're listening to the Joy of Champagne podcast, your guide to the world of sparkling wines. And now your host, Deniz Bayram.
Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of Joy of Champagne. I'm your host, Deniz Bayram. I'm a certified specialist of wine and a trained chef. Now, as a devoted wine lover, my goal is to spread my contagious passion and love for fine wine. In our second episode, we're continuing our Champagne 101 series as we learn the very fundamentals of sparkling wines and champagne. And after our first episode, we should now know that those two are not the same in every instance. Today, we'll talk about the production methods of champagne and also sparkling wines. We've divided the subject into 2 episodes because it's quite a complex issue to tackle. But I will explain each and every step of what goes into making delicious champagne and sparkling wines one by one. First of all, we'll focus on the champagne method, also known as the traditional method. So I think it would be fair enough, even before that, to start talking about what wine is first and how wine is made. As some may know, wine is simply fermented grape juice. What we're really interested in is the process of fermentation, because it creates what we call the best stuff in wine, the good stuff that we want, which are, of course, alcohol and bubbles. You might ask yourself, if fermentation creates bubbles, then why not all wines are sparkling? Well, there's a very simple answer to that, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But first, we should understand how fermentation works. As in other fermented products, the fermentation process has 2 key players. They are yeast and sugar. Yeast is something we're all familiar with. We use it to bake breads or to brew beer, and this is oftentimes exactly the same kind of yeast that goes into making wine as well. So we can either add this yeast, introduce it to the grape juice, or wait for the natural ambient yeast to get in there and slowly start working. Though, as expected, this can be much less efficient. The sugar is naturally abundant and very much present in the grape juice, so it is a natural haven for yeast to feast on. Fermentation takes place when these 2 elements meet. As the yeast starts consuming the sugar, turning it to alcohol, the grape juice loses its sweetness gradually. But other than alcohol, 2 more very detrimental elements are created by the yeast as byproducts. These are the carbon dioxide gas and heat. So as the yeast starts fermenting the wine starts to heat up very, very gradually, and the yeast starts producing alcohol, but also emits CO2 up into the ambient. But what happens to the CO2 is what really concerns us, because I did point out that not all wines are sparkling, especially still wines that we widely consume on an everyday basis. Red wines, white wines, rosé wines. And if fermentation creates CO2 in every instance, what happened to those CO2 gases when we're making still wine? Well, it's very simple. When we're making still wine, we make them in huge open vats. And for this reason, the CO2 that's been produced during the fermentation just releases into the air and basically disappears. But when we make sparkling wines, we want to hold on to that very precious CO2 to have our fizz within our wine. So what we do in order to keep that fizz in the wine is to have a second fermentation where we can have a new creation of CO2 within the wine, so we can have a fresh CO2 present in the wine. So in order to do this in champagne method, to begin with, we start with a still wine. So before we even decide to make champagne, we first have to make a still white wine. The way we create the CO2 bubbles in new wine, in the still wine, is by having a second fermentation. But the wine is fermented to dryness and there is no sugar or yeast left in the wine. It's a stable white wine. So how can we get a second fermentation to start in the still white wine? To do that, the champagne makers add a mix of sugar and yeast in their still white wine. This is completely a new addition to the still wine, which then, of course, kickstarts another fermentation because the mixture of yeast and sugar equals fermentation, which means alcohol and CO2. So the way they do this is once they have their still wine, they directly bottle the still wine. And then right after, they add the addition of sugar and yeast, which is added in the form of almost like a syrup mixture. So this obviously creates the second fermentation within each bottle. But since the bottles are closed right after this mixture is added in, there's nowhere for the CO2 that's been produced by the fermentation to escape. So this creates the beautiful, fine, foamy bubbles that we love to have in champagne. So this is in its most simple form how champagne is made. But how does Prosecco and other simpler, less expensive sparkling wines differ from this, especially Prosecco? When you think about it, the production methods are actually almost identical, the way champagne and Prosecco is produced. But there's one only single difference that makes the whole difference between Prosecco and champagne. We know that they taste very different, and we know that they are priced quite differently as well. But the single difference is what really makes the quality difference between those wines. And the difference is that during the second fermentation progress, compared to champagne, Prosecco and other less expensive, simpler sect, for example, are fermented in big tanks. So the second fermentation, as opposed to champagne, takes place in big vats, tanks, as opposed to bottles. The reason why this makes less costly and therefore a less complex and simpler sparkling wine is that since champagne is fermented for the second time in individual bottles, it makes a much higher quality sparkling wine with more abundance of CO2 within individual bottles compared to a second fermentation that takes place in a Prosecco tank, for example, because the second fermentation that happens in the tank is not as strong as second fermentation that would take place in an individual champagne bottle. It's quite simply less expensive and has less of an effect in terms of the pressure and the level of carbon dioxide that is produced in the wine. So yes, the logic of how sparkling wine is made and the process of how those beautiful bubbles are created in basically all sparkling wines from champagne to Prosecco is basically the same. But the difference that is paramount is how these processes, the second fermentation process, takes place and where it takes place. That makes the whole difference. So these are the main differences between the two major production methods of sparkling wines, the champagne method and the Charmat method. On our next episode, we will talk more about what happens next after these wines are produced this way, and how are they aged after they're made, and how do their aging processes differ from each other. And thank you for listening, and until next time, stay bubbly.
Before we end, a word from our sponsors. This episode of the Joy of Champagne podcast was brought to you by
The Excelsior by Dukes, one of the world's finest champagne flutes. 10.7 inches tall with a 10-ounce capacity. Handcrafted and mouth-blown, lead-free crystal glass. Find out more at clubdukes.co. That's spelled clubdux.co. Because there are some things man can make better than any machine.
Thanks for listening to the Joy of Champagne podcast, your guide to the world of sparkling wines. We hope you join us on the next episode. In the meantime, feel free to visit us at joyofchampagne.com or drop us an email at hello@joyofchampagne.com.